All right, it's time to tear things up over here. Yeah, we're gonna tear that ass up. Hello, friends and lovers, it's Haelian, and today we're gonna do something a bit more goofy. We're gonna rank the Hades call boons on our traditional tier list, S, A, B, C, and F. We're gonna have some fun with it. I'm gonna show you some footage of how they're all used and explain as much as I can about them. And I'm gonna tell you why you're pretty much all wrong about your favorite call boons, probably, okay? Going to talk about how useful they are both in a single charge and if you get the call gauge full as well. If they're not very useful on a single charge, then they're probably not going to get very high rank, just to warn you. And I guess a quick tip about call boons is, in order to charge up your call meter, it's based on the number of hits you deliver. Not how much damage you deliver, but simply the number of hits. So the more instances of damage you deliver to the enemies, the more quickly your call gauge is going to build up. For instance, if you use the rail and Zeus's attack that's very rapid, and you have multiple instances of damage, it's going to build up that call meter very, very quickly. Whereas if you're using like the Arthur sword, it's going to build up very slowly. But you do still build up gauge from taking damage as well. And I think that's based more on just how much damage you take, maybe as a percentage, but actually I'm not certain about that. That's a good question. Anyway, let's get to ranking these bad boys. So first we have Aries up on the chop block. So Aries, you become invulnerable. You literally become a blade rift or whatever we want to call it. You get to become a blender for a pretty brief moment, and it deals what I would describe as a pretty minimal amount of damage there. It is usable as a way to simply escape some amount of damage, and I should probably bring up though that call boons are kind of special in the game in the sense that when you use them, you actually get this brief moment of invulnerability, even if it's not built into the boon itself. So I guess I'll talk about it with another boon later on, but you do become briefly invulnerable. You get what they call iframes when you use your call boon, almost like as an extra dash slightly, in order to potentially avoid damage. But anyway, Aries actually gives you full invulnerability for the duration of it. It's usable in a single use. It just doesn't deal a lot of damage, and it's surprisingly difficult to stay on top of the enemies. Maybe if it just was a lot bigger, it would be okay, I kind of think. Like if the area of effect was much, much larger, I think that maybe it'd be usable, because I think another problem with it is it doesn't really have much AoE at all. You're not going to hit more than one, maybe two enemies in a lucky instance, it feels, I think, a lot of the time. It's okay. It's probably... No, it's really not okay, to be honest. It's all relative to the other call boons. And sure, we could talk about how you could get all these other supplementary boons to make it better. But is it worth taking it? Is it worth trying to build up? Is it worth trying to get palms on? No, it's not. But I don't think it's worthy of F. I don't think it's worthy of F, but it's probably going to be one of the lower ones that we have on the list. All right, next up we got Zeus, who is the very opposite of that. So Zeus, like I was kind of discussing, you do not become invulnerable when you use it, but because you're simply using a call boon, you do get that brief moment, like a kind of just a certain amount of frames in the game that lets you become invulnerable. I guess that's just important to know about calls in general as a tip. You know what I mean? But anyway, Zeus deals a lot of damage in a rather large AoE. It's very, very useful in just the single gauge use as well. It's not that you have to build it up to a full call, which is important because a lot of rooms you're just not going to get to a full call, right? So if the boon's only going to be useful if you get to a full call and you don't get there for, 9 out of 10 rooms, what's the point of it? You know what I'm saying? But anyway, Zeus is always useful. Not to mention Zeus has amazing tier 2 boons. So if you get Zeus's call boon, you can get other amazing boons like Jolted and Double Strike, and then the legendary high voltages, whatever, you know what I mean? Enable some really good duo boons as well. When you think about it, Smoldering Air is an amazing duo boon with Zeus's call. Let's see, you got Sea Storm. I believe the Zeus's call boon is an activator for Sea Storm potentially if you wanted. Zeus's call is honestly one of the best single boons in the game. I think it's just always a good take. It's never wrong. It's just incredibly strong. It's probably too strong in a lot of ways. It is probably got to be the strongest call boon in the game. Can recommend. Don't bother building up a full gauge. Just like keep using it. Get in that habit of just using it every so often and try to use it up. Don't let the room end with the gauge filled up too much there. All right, now here's where I'm going to tick people off, I think. We have Artemis next. Best girl Artemis. Oh, how they did her call boon dirty. So the problem with Artemis's boon, so let's describe what it does, I guess. It It fires a single arrow, essentially, if you use a single charge. Though the charges are much quicker to build. But it fires a single arrow, which has a chance to crit, a pretty decent chance to crit. But it's a pretty small amount of damage, really. And the problem with it is it has 0 AoE whatsoever. It's going to hit one target. That one arrow is going to hit a singular target. And while we can sit here and talk about how if you palm it up and everything, and if you let the gauge build to full, you can deal a big chunk of damage to one enemy, essentially, maybe a couple enemies, if you have them in like the heroes fight, you know what I mean? It'll do okay. You know, you can have a goofy run, and it's fun to see those big damage numbers. But when you think of it relative to the other call boons, it's not good. It's not good. The problem more than anything is the fact that the single use is just so weak. It just deals so little damage. It's just not good, I'm afraid. A lot of Artemis's supplemental boons to the calls too are not great. It has like that Hunter's Instinct boon is probably one of the worst boons in the game ever that I've ever seen before in my life. But yeah, it's just it's like almost on the cusp of. I almost feel like the base damage should have been a little bit higher, because I think the palm scaling is actually pretty decent. But is it worth putting palms into still? I just don't think so. It's C, but it beats out Aries at least, because you can practically use it the same, but at least it has a much better use if you do get a full gauge going on. You can also use it as like a oh crap kind of thing to try to avoid an instance of damage though, if you wanted. All right, next we got Athena. So Athena is a very straightforward one. You become invulnerable for a very, very brief period of time. It's just like a second or so. You deflect attacks and projectiles during that moment, but you can also act in that time. You can actually deal damage with your attacks, or especially your casts, unlike Ares's call, where you're just locked into that Blade Rift animation, right? So you might think, what's the big difference between Athena's and Aries? At least with the Aries, you deal damage with the call itself. But Athena's is kind of better a little bit, I think. They last similar amounts of time, but Athena allows you, A, when you palm it, you can make it last longer, which I think is a better bonus. And B, you can perform all your other attacks instead while using Athena's aid. And it works really well if you get a full gauge built up as well. If you think you're going to have a longer fight, if you're in a boss fight, for instance. It's a pretty good one. It's not very exciting, that's for sure, right? It's useful though. It is a useful one, and I think it's kind of just it's very middle of the road here, I think, is where Athena winds up. Whether it's going to be a high B or low B, I don't know. There's really nothing else really special to say about it. You can do anything you want while you're using it, except maybe, I think the summon button might not work randomly, but yeah, it's just kind of okay. Okay, next is Demeter. So Demeter, you summon a swirling ice rift, or whatever you want to call it. Very large AoE radius. Very nice AoE radius on that. Damage very low. It does apply chill to all the enemies that it's going to hit, though, at least. It's kind of, I guess it's not really similar to Aries, but I mean, it just, the animation looks so slightly similar, but you get to perform all your actions while the ice rift comes out and hits all the enemies. It's actually one that I think is, I don't know if I'd say underrated, but maybe underappreciated, because I actually think it's pretty good. It's good for clearing rooms with lots of enemies. It's probably less useful against the bosses versus some of these other call boons here, but because of that large AoE and everything, I think it's pretty good. If you get like Killing Freeze, it's okay. Arctic Blast is kind of overrated in my eyes. It's not that great. But I kind of think Demeter's is just kind of okay. It's not bad. It's not great. You know, it's not my first choice, but I would definitely pick it over, let's see. If I were to pick it over here, I'd probably pick it over Athena's most of the time, unless, you know, I'm doing like a super high heat run. Would I take Athena's? Even then, I don't know. I'm not so certain. I might still take Demeter just because it's free damage and it's not too bad. Basically, the utility of the chill is kind of nice versus the enemies as well, right? Okay, here's where people are gonna get upset with me, and I know it. Aphrodite. Okay, so here's what happens when you use Aphrodite's call boon. So when it's not at a full meter, you will throw at a heart at enemies that deals 0 damage and briefly charms them. If you palm this boon, then it'll up the time that the enemy is charmed for. Now, bosses get a much reduced charm time versus regular enemies. It can only hit one enemy as well, And then if you do manage to build up a full gauge, it'll deal a whopping 2,500 damage before some other bonuses you could have, like privilege status. So you could actually up that damage even more. Again, it'll only hit one enemy. It's going to be whatever enemy you are closest to when you use it as well. So keep that in mind if you're going to save it for that. Now, here's the thing. This boon is terrible, okay? It is so bad. It is one of the worst boons ever. Not even just call boons, but just a bad boon in general. So again, this kind of comes down to the fact that building up a full call gauge is actually quite difficult in a lot of runs on a room-by-room basis. Now, the average boss room is probably going to last a little bit longer, and you might be able to get to a full gauge during those rooms, but in every other room leading up to that, was this call boon useful? Was Aphrodite's charm really useful to maybe it grabbed an enemy and pulled them away and had them hit another enemy? But it's just... It's not really all the boon's fault or the damage fault. It's the fact that the charm effect is just not great. Like, especially the reduced time on the bosses, unless you palm it a ton, it's just so short and it's so underwhelming. I probably got some footage here for y'all to see of me doing like a goofy charm build or a charm run that you can check out. I'll link it also, but I'm afraid it's just not good. You know, the other thing is 2,500 damage, right? That's a lot. 2,500 damage is a big number. But there's issues here. It's that there's no AoE. It's only going to hit one enemy. So you got to make sure it hits the enemy that you really want. And number two, 2,500 damage is almost too much in a lot of instances. Either A, you're overkilling a very small enemy potentially, right? That just doesn't need that much damage. Or B, you're hitting a boss that might be already almost dead, or it's going to hit its next phase, and therefore it's going to gobble up that damage, because you can't over damage a boss's health meter, if that makes sense. You know, if Theseus is about to enter phase 2 and is only 50 health away from entering that phase, if you use that full call, it's only going to deal 50 damage. So it's kind of like, it's almost too much. It's too unwieldy. It's goofy. Charm builds are like fun. I don't know. I don't even know if you can call it a charm build. It's because it's just for the memes at the end of the day. And I know I'm ranting about Aphrodite's here, but I have to explain why it's so bad, I feel. But yeah, I think the main downside is the fact that the charm effect is kind of underwhelming, and the fact that this boon is like totally useless unless you get a full gauge in my eyes because of the charm effect there. I think that warrants it as the official F tier call boon of the list. But moving on to something that is good, here we go. We got Dionysus's Aid. And you might look at something like Dionysus and be like, why is this one good compared to Aphrodite's? And there's a lot of reasons actually for it. Number one, you can use it in a single gauge instance and it works really well. It has a large AoE radius around it. The hangover damage is actually really, really high, but I'm going to explain why you got to be careful about it. And it just stacks up all that hangover. It can deal a lot of damage to a large group of enemies very, very quickly. It's just so useful like that. There's not a lot of good follow-up boons, so therefore I don't think it's as good as Zeus is. There's not a lot of good tier 2 boons for Dionysus's hangover, essentially. So hangover damage, you have to understand that if you have multiple ways to apply hangover damage, whatever the newest instance is going to override the stacks. So let's say, you know, you use the call and it applies 5 stacks that deal 20 damage each. Pretty good, right? If you override that, if you hit them with the dash that only applies 2 hangover damage, it's going to override everything there, basically. And it's only going to deal, I don't know, what is that, 10 damage instead, you know what I mean? Because it's whatever the newest instance of hangover is. So Dionysus's Aid is really, really good as long as you don't have other ways to apply hangover, if that makes sense. You wouldn't want to take it if you're using hangover in another place, essentially. But it's still a very strong call boon, and it's just a strong boon in general. It's one of the higher takes from Dionysus in the general build, I think. So I think it belongs up in the S for that large AoE and pretty large damage output. All right, and Poseidon. So Poseidon is an interesting one, I always felt. So it deals a pretty moderate amount of damage. You become invulnerable. It pushes enemies away. It doesn't last very long. You can usually without palms or that extra boon that makes it last longer. I kind of forgot about that boon. Without that, you can usually hit like a boss twice, maybe even 3 times if you're lucky. I can't remember. You can deal like an okay amount of damage. You're also invulnerable. You push enemies away, which is generally a good thing. They can bonk into walls and take damage that way. It's kind of okay. Poseidon's follow-up boons to the knockback effects are incredibly strong, really. You have Razor Shoals and you have Breaking Wave. Those are just amazing boons in general. So those are nice things to think about when you're taking Poseidon's Call, potentially. I think the fact that you can use it in a single gauge instance, you could save up the full gauge. I don't think you really want to. And speaking of which, you don't want to do that with Dionysus's either, because it's kind of overkill. You'd really only want to use that in single use best you can. But yeah, Poseidon's, yeah, I think single use is just better and just kind of get you out of those oh shit moments potentially whenever you can. And it does pretty good. It's pretty good. I would definitely put it above everything in the B tier, but it definitely doesn't belong in S tier, I think. All right, I know it's 2023, but spoiler warning, if you don't know what that symbol is in the bottom left, you have been officially warned. This is a spoiler for the game of Hades for personal computer. So if you're sensitive to those, you will have to click away now. So this is Hades' Call boon, essentially. You get it from that keepsake, the Sigil of the Dead, that you unlock in the very, very late game. And what it does is it turns you invisible, and it allows your next hit to deal, assuming you have the keepsake maxed out, deal double damage. Now, if you get a full gauge built up, and there's only 2 charges to the gauge, but it takes the same amount of time to charge. If you get the full gauge built up, then it just lasts for, I don't know, like 5-ish seconds, and they say invisible the whole time, but they really just mean you're invulnerable. You can't be damaged during that time, and you deal double damage that whole time as well. So it's a pretty good offensive keepsake. I wouldn't call it very good defensively because it only has the 2 charges to it. It's kind of hard to build up. It's kind of just okay. I mean, in terms of damage output, it has better potential than something like Artemis or Aphrodite's at a full gauge, I think there. It's particular, honestly. I wouldn't describe it as good. You'll see a lot of speedrunners use it, but that's really just because of a lot of reasons. Namely, it fills like the call boon slot without actually having to pick up a boon. To fill that slot, they can focus on different boons instead in that time, and it kind of supplements all the other high damage boons that a speedrunner is already going to have toward the end of the game. And plus, 100% more damage is kind of a lot, especially if you time it just right with using specific actions, namely with Beowulf or Hera. You can like kind of line up this big chunky attack. So to the average player, I don't think it's very good. To a speedrunner, it's probably very useful, or maybe it's just that we don't have anything better. I'm not really certain at that point. This is a hard one to rank because I don't think I would tell most players to use it because I just don't think it's very useful, nor is it very fun because you can't like palm it or anything like that. You know what I mean? I think it belongs in the C's, honestly. It has that particular instance like I mentioned, but after that, yeah, I don't know. All right, that's my tier list for the call boons. I don't know if I have other tier lists in mind, but if you have ideas, feel free to let me know. And feel free to tell me what you think of the tier list here. Do you love it, hate it? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Like and subscribe if you haven't already for some reason. Get lots more Hades content shoved down your throat by me. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you later.